everyone. Ranger William here from the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail, bringing you part 2 of our program, Rogues, Banditti, and Crackers, the Southern Backcountry in the American Revolution. Now, what we talked about in part 1, our introduction, we talked about the unique backcountry culture that existed on the western frontiers of the southern colonies at the time of the American Revolution. We talked about how this kind of has a place in our national history, our national memory, that is bordering on pride, kind of these rough, tough people and how they defeated the British. But who were these people really? How did they get here? So in part 1, we talked about why it was good to be in the British Empire, all the benefits that you see of being British in the mid-18th century. We talked about all the problems. We talked about the reasons that people, especially poor farmers, lower class farmers, reasons they're having to leave Britain, especially the Irish, the Scot-Irish, and where they're going to in the colonies. They're going to Philadelphia. They're immigrating, and by the time of the Revolution, 250,000 strong. Now, we also talked about how you have a large German migration happening. These people are pushing onto the frontier. Their cultures are kind of blending a bit with the log cabin like you see pictured here on the side, and they're following the farmland, looking for the next big opportunity, leading them down into the Shenandoah Valley. So that's where we're going to pick up here with part 2 of our program. There it is. They swarm like the Goths and Vandals of old. So what are we talking about here? The people who are just pouring into the Shenandoah Valley, looking for the best farmland, the best opportunity. You're going to see the white population of the Shenandoah Valley is going to double every 10 to 12 years. So you're looking over, from the mid to late 18th century, a huge population boom is happening. In the 1730s, early on, you have Virginia Governor William Byrd is already noting this. He says, quote, "Scots-Irish who flock thither in such numbers that there is not elbow room for them. They swarm like the Goths and Vandals of old and will overspread our continent soon." Now, what you're seeing happen, this river of immigrants coming into the Virginia, coming into the colonies, it's not going to dwindle as it goes further down into Virginia. It's actually going to grow. It's not going to dwindle out, because as you get further down into Virginia, not only do you have the new arrivals from Germany, Ireland, Scotland, England, they are being joined by the grown children of settlers who had already got farms established up in Pennsylvania. Their kids have grown, they need farms of their own, they're joining the move south. You're also having farmers who think, hey, just more opportunity, one more move south is going to kind of improve their opportunity, improve their chances. So you actually see this river of immigration is growing as you get into Virginia, not running out. There's one governor of Pennsylvania, I came across the quote one time and I haven't been able to find it ever again, but he says something to the effect of, your average Irishman isn't happy until he's moved 3 times. So that being my background myself, I kind of identify with that, yeah. But that's what he's seeing happen, is these people are constantly picking up and moving, following their opportunity. Even in the 1760s, you have a kind of a scout, a British captain named Gavin Cochrane is going to make a tour of the colonies, reporting back to Lord Dartmouth in Parliament. He's going to say that, quote, "What is meant by crackers, a name they have got from being great boasters," that's a Scottish slang for bragging and boasting. He says that they are a lawless set of rascals on the frontiers of Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia, who often change their place of abode. So you start to see this becoming one of these features, this kind of identifiable feature, is they're always picking up and moving, they're trying to go someplace next. Now, we're not looking at just farmers by themselves picking up and going, but that third point down that you'll see there, entire communities and congregations. What you're seeing happen, it's not just one farmer and maybe his kids, it's the extended family. It's brothers, sisters, cousins, sometimes entire church congregations are going to agree to settle somewhere else. Maybe not all at one time, maybe just a handful of scouts first to get the kind of infrastructure, get that started, and then they're going to be joined. They're moving into a new world as they're going down into just the next colony. It's a new world to them, filled with strangers and dangers. They need to have people that they can trust, people that they know. They want to know that they're going to have their own church, their own teachers, their own preachers, and the best way to do that is to bring people with you. Now, an increasing number of settlers in Virginia are going to be described as landless. This does not mean that they are just like they're migrating or nomads. It just means that they don't have legal claim to the land they're living on. Because the further away they're getting from authority figures, the further on the cutting edge of the frontier, the less likely they are to be busted as squatters. So if you just live there without a legal land claim, that means that you don't have to pay rent. Or if suddenly you start to get more developed, there starts to be a sheriff, there starts to be a land office, and you get busted, you can just say, hey, the paperwork is being filed, but it hasn't been completed yet. The check is in the mail, pretty much. You see this kind of used to kind of buy more time. Now, one way you can kind of tell how long people have been living in one place, you can see what they're growing. That becomes a way to kind of measure the farms that you see popping up in Virginia. So what you kind of see are these different stages over here on the left. Let me get my laser pointer. So these different stages of these crops here on the left, you're going to start out with people being described as just hunting for their food. That's going to be their only thing that they're doing to try and bring in food. But then they're going to start to maybe keep some cattle and hogs along with hunting. Then they're going to start to clear a little bit of land, and they're going to start to plant corn. Usually not clearing the stumps, going to be very, very rough kind of fields. Once they've been there a while, they start to get a little better food source. They start to get go for wheat, start to clear fields and have a wheat crop. And let me get rid of my picture here so you can see behind me this great image. It looks to be kind of turn of the 19th century. Likely going to be European farmers there gathering hemp. Hemp becomes a huge crop in the Shenandoah Valley. This is thanks to actually what's kind of like a parliamentary subsidy, because it's going to be the hemp fiber used to make the ropes for the Royal Navy. And it was estimated that a British warship, a man of war, needed about 50 to 55 tons of hemp fiber just to make the rope for it. So you're looking at Augusta County, Virginia, the southern part of the Shenandoah Valley, averaging 100,000 pounds of hemp annually exported to market. So that is a huge cash crop in the Shenandoah Valley. So if you've got some farmers that they're in the Shenandoah Valley, they've already got a hemp crop in the ground, they've been there for a while. They're getting pretty established. They're making some money. Now, this is not to say that everything in Virginia is just people settling and they're farming and they're happy, but it's a very, very rough place because of all the movement, because of all the new people moving through. For example, one famous Virginian from the valley, Daniel Morgan, described as growing up in what he called Battletown on the Great Wagon Road, the Winchester area. He's going to become known as a brawler. A later traveler through the valley, Thomas Twining, is going to be warned by some folks as he's coming through a tavern. He says, quote, "They jokingly advised me to be on my guard against the Virginian practice of gouging, by which a man dexterously forced out the eye of another." He goes on to describe that he had someone demonstrate this on himself before finally calling uncle and getting the guy to back off. So it's a rough place to live. Now, by the 1770s, what you're seeing happen is the northern part of the Shenandoah Valley has developed kind of a distinctive German culture due to just the large number of German settlers coming in from Pennsylvania. And the southern valley, the southern part, is going to be distinctively Scot-Irish. Those who have kind of continued to keep moving on, to keep pushing for those opportunities. So you can kind of notice that as you drive down the valley, down I-81, some of the names of the counties and the towns you pass through, you can note some of these cultural influences, which is a really neat remnant to see. But as they keep pushing south through the valley, through Virginia, they're eventually going to arrive in the Carolinas. Now, what you see happening, we're going to talk about, your first western North Carolina. Again, so coming down from Virginia, your first western land claims are going to be in about the mid-1740s, but that's when you see the paperwork show up. And again, as we've seen, a lot of these people will live there as squatters for a long time before you start getting the paperwork filed. So potentially earlier than the 1740s, the area around the Yadkin Catawba rivers is seeing this white farmer settlement coming down from Virginia. Now, let's talk about this paperwork process. I mentioned it a little bit. I mentioned how people could say, oh, it was being processed, the check is in the mail. it was a very tricky process. For example, if you arrive in North Carolina, you're going to have to apply for a grant. That's going to mean to write up what you want to be your land and send that about 300 miles away towards Edenton, the coast of North Carolina, to the land office. It's going to apply. They're going to write up a warrant, issue it out to a surveyor to go and check those boundaries that you were talking about, to check those markers. That could alone take up to a year. Once the land is surveyed, that written up survey comes back to the land office. It's written up, drawn up into a grant, and you, as the initiator, you then have about 1 year to come and pick up that paperwork at that land office. Once you pick that up, then you start paying rent. Hooray. So, you know, if you have lived there for a while, if you let that year expire without picking up that land grant, it's going to be declared void. That land is back available and someone else can file a survey for it. So if you, for example, arrived from Virginia, you lived somewhere for a few years to kind of scope it out, to see if you liked it, you've got to have a cabin, got to have some shelter, got to have some food so you get crops in the ground. Then you start the paperwork process. We'll say you've been there 2 years, then you start the paperwork. That takes 2 years. And if you end up not picking up your grant, that could be 4 or 5 years after you actually have started living somewhere that you then find out that land is not yours and it now belongs to somebody else. So you have it's a very tricky, very messy process. What's making this even worse is sometimes your surveyors aren't the best. They're using the meets and bounds system, so they're going off of landmarks, they're going off of other existing land grants. Sometimes they talk about their posts, their markings being, oh, they turned left at the tree, or you go until the oak, and they don't say which oak. There's a few accounts I've read of where there was a land dispute and people would go out and just cut down the marker tree. They knew which one it was, they got rid of it, so no surveyors could ever find it, and so they couldn't challenge their claim, or they couldn't give it away to somebody else as easily. So very confusing, a bit crazy out on the western frontier. Now in the 1750s, North Carolina land agents, they start to get a good idea. They start requiring people to put a deposit down when they request a grant. That gives them a little more incentive to actually come back, pick up the grant, receive their deposit back. Of course, then they'd have to start paying rent. But this doesn't deter people. North Carolina Governor Arthur Dobbs in 1754, he says, quote, "These settlers who are coming in hundreds of wagons from the northwards to take up land in the back settlements." So you've got a lot of people moving in here. And why are they coming in? It's the same trends that you see in Virginia. You've got whole communities coming down, Scot-Irish, Germans. Again, Governor Arthur Dobbs, later in 55, he describes these Western settlers. He says, quote, "There are at present 75 families on my lands, from 5 or 6 to 10 children in each family." He says, here's a good part, "They are a colony from Ireland removed from Pennsylvania of what we call Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, who with others in the neighboring tract had settled together in order to have a teacher of their own opinion and choice. Besides these, there are 22 families of Germans or Swiss who are all an industrious people." So that's the earliest reference I've seen to the term Scotch-Irish being used. This is also a great quote referencing the fact that they're Presbyterians, the fact that it's because they settle together because they want a teacher of their own choice, meaning a Presbyterian minister, not recognized as a preacher by the government, by the Church of England, but called teachers instead. Now, the new farmers who are coming down into the backcountry, they also note that they are pretty industrious. They describe them as kind of being more industrious than those who live in the eastern part of North Carolina, where you've got not as great farm soil, you've got a lot more pine trees, and they're using those pine trees to make naval products out of that pine tar, pitch, tar, turpentine, things that the naval industry, the shipping industry relies on. They can make these using the tar from those pine trees. So this is where you're going to, one of the reasons you can get that the North Carolina Tar Heels is because of this industry. Later, North Carolina Governor William Tryon in 1766, he's going to say that "I am of opinion This province is settling faster than any on the continent. Last autumn and winter, upwards of 1,000 wagons passed through Salisbury with families from the northward. So this huge influx of traffic coming through North Carolina, but how do we know that they're staying here? One great way is to measure your militia musters, your militia regiments. Not like Pennsylvania, which was pacifist, did not have mandatory militia service. You have militia service in Virginia and the Carolinas. So it's going to be every eligible fighting age man, ages about 16 to 60 usually. So you're going to see how many men are showing up in their counties to be registered, to be trained. In the western counties of North Carolina, over a 15-year window, you see that number go from 100 fighting-aged men to over 3,000, and the quote says they were increasing daily. Now, they're not all armed, but they're there and they're showing up. So it's a way we can kind of measure some of the people moving down. And talking about moving down, they keep going into South Carolina. Now, we've talked about the movement down from Virginia, but why are they coming down from Virginia? Yes, they're looking for land. Yes, it's the next available, kind of the cutting edge of that frontier. But you also see these incentives from North Carolina and South Carolina trying to recruit these people to come down and settle in the western parts. On our text here, that top quote of free poor Protestants, what they're looking for, the colonial government, the leadership, the elites of these colonies, they are putting these offers out because they want a buffer. They want to bring down usually white Protestant arms-bearing men to live between the government on the eastern low country part of the colony and the French beyond the empire's borders to the west. Either the French or French allied or perceived hostile Native American nations. That's going to be one reason that they want these people to move down, to kind of make that buffer. But South Carolina, there's another reason. South Carolina, the coastal region, is going to be about 75% of the population are going to be enslaved Africans and African Americans. So you have a huge fear of that small white ruling minority. They are terrified of a slave insurrection, of these enslaved men and women realizing the numbers advantage they have and taking back their freedom. So they are trying to recruit and entice more arms-bearing white people to live down there around them nearby, where they can not only deter the French or the Spanish or hostile native nations, but also the internal enemy, the enslaved Africans and African Americans. So yes, one of the incentives that they're going to use to try to entice this settlement is going to be the headright system. So North Carolina, usually you would arrive, you would apply for a grant. They averaged about 640 acres is what you're going to be able to apply for. South Carolina is going to be different. They're going to say that you, as the head of household, will automatically get 100 acres, just automatically. And then for every head you bring with you, meaning your children, meaning servants or enslaved people, that is going to be 50 additional acres per head. So that quote we talked about earlier, where your average farmer has as many as maybe 10 kids, well, that's 500 more acres just by bringing your kids with you. And also you're going to see certain places are going to be kind of considered high risk or high need districts where they need settlers, they need farmers, and there's going to be additional incentives, things such as tax-free for so many years, or money to go towards crops, tools, seed for your farms, whatever you're going to need. So you start to see them coming down to South Carolina. But also you're going to see another avenue kind of begin, another immigration river in the 1770s. You're going to see this flow from the north joined by a flow coming directly across from Europe into Charleston and coming up through the low country, going to the back country, but coming in at Charleston. One of my favorite kind of examples of this is going to be Alexander Chesney. He is a loyalist in the American Revolution. He's involved in the Battle of Kings Mountain, wrote about it after the war, and he says that when he was a young boy, his family came from Ireland, moved directly through Charleston into the backcountry of South Carolina, and where they settled in the backcountry, they had at least 15 different cousins and relatives on the rivers and creeks around them. So you're seeing people who maybe they've had family come down the traditional route, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and they've written back home, back to Scotland, Ireland, wherever, and they've told them about the opportunities, the offerings here for farmers, and they're taking up those offers, and the second avenue of immigration is happening. You do see a bit of tension kind of created in the 1760s, 1770s, as you see these now kind of two groups competing for the same territory. We'll talk about that in another episode. Now, the cutting edge of this frontier expansion, kind of the end of the road for a lot of these immigrants, is going to be the literal end of the road, the end of the wagon road. Let me see if I can move my screen here. I cannot, so I'll just go away. 1773 is Georgia. This is the newest opportunity for farmers coming down from the northward. The wagon road is going to kind of end in about Augusta, Georgia. What you're seeing happen in 73 is Governor Wright of Georgia has just had this large land cession with the Creek Nation. Now, it was not all agreed to by the Creek Nation, so you're going to see a lot of hostility, a lot of violence on this new territory, but that's going to be the most recently opened area for legal settlement prior to the beginning of the American Revolution. Some governors even talk about, yeah, we had all these people who passed through on their way to Georgia, but they got there, they saw how rough it was, and they've come back up to resettle here. So that's going to be kind of the cutting edge, the end of the road is going to be there in Georgia. Now, some folks, they are not going to just say south is the only way. They're going to look at another direction. So let's talk about those who look west. The same way that you had colonial governors trying to limit the settlements, trying to say, okay, we're going to keep the peace between the farmers and the native nations to the west. We're going to keep them from settling too close to each other, keep the farmers from taking Indian land. The British government is going to try that same thing. They're going to try and limit the backcountry spread to keep the peace. The taxation that was passed for the colonies in the wake of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, all those taxes were earmarked to pay for defense of the colonies. That is how expensive it is trying to keep the peace on the North American frontier. So Parliament says, look, well, if we can just keep the two sides separate, if they will recognize this line as the boundary, then we don't need as many forts, garrisons, troops, expenses. We can stop running up this debt. So the Proclamation Line of 1763, it's going to run right along the Appalachian Mountains, along the crest. You can roughly say it was the Appalachian Trail. This is going to be dividing the colonies for white settlement and then the Native Nations land to the west. It does not work. The same way you saw colonial governors trying to keep people from pushing west, the British government's going to try this, and it just makes people angry. Now, the commander of British troops in North America, the commander of all these garrisons before the revolution begins, General Thomas Gage, he's going to say, quote, "I am fully convinced that the boundary lines will never be observed. The frontier people are too numerous, too lawless, and too licentious ever to be restrained." So you're looking at, this is the biggest threat to them. They know that the biggest threat to the peace, to keeping peace on the frontier, are these farmers pushing west. Gage goes on and he says, quote, "I know of nothing so likely to interrupt and disturb our tranquility with the Indians as the incessant attempts to defraud them of their land by clandestine purchase." So why are the people not listening? Why are they so angry about this proclamation line in 1763? You look at pretty much every level of colonial society is going to want that land, going to want to take that native land in the West. So let's start at the very bottom, your settlers, your farmers. These guys want fertile farmland. Now that the war is done, they're no longer worried about the big scary French on the other side of the mountains. There have been peace treaties with the different native nations all along the frontier. So they say, well, that means that the English have won. That means we can go where we want. That means we can take that land. Especially if you have guys who were French and Indian War veterans who served under the belief that they were going to get that land for their service, they especially feel entitled to go and take it. Now, the next level up, you have merchants. You have traders who have done business with the native nations, and they pulled a fast one, is what they've done. they have allowed their customers, their native customers, to run up huge tabs of credit at their trading stores, knowing that it's so high they will never be able to actually work off and pay off that debt the traditional way with hunting. They're going to say, well, just give me a couple thousand acres, make your mark here, and we'll call it even Steven. So they want access to that land for payment. And on the next level up, you have the speculators. We talked about them back in Pennsylvania, people who are wanting to buy massive tracts of land, tens, hundreds of thousands of acres, and then chop it up, subdivide, sell it at a profit to all these land-hungry farmers pushing west. Now, the very top level of colonial society, even the government, the governors themselves, they want this land. Partly, I mentioned the French and Indian War veterans. They were planning to use that land to pay the people in their colony, to pay the veterans who have served. So they want to get that land to be able to make good on those promises, and they are getting the complaints from the farmers, the merchants, the speculators. It's all going up to them. So they're wanting to keep the peace, they're wanting to keep goodwill, they're wanting to make good on their promises to these veterans. They want that land. Now the first kind of lasting white settler that we believe is going to push across this line and stay there is going to be William Bean in 1769. Just a few years after this line is drawn, they're already crossing over it. He's going to be settling there in East Tennessee. And so they start to trickle across. Squatters are making their way across. Again, they assume there's going to be another treaty pretty soon, another push of the boundary line, as they've seen all throughout the other colonies. And that is what happens. Again, their expectations are reinforced with that dangerous precedent. The Treaty of Hard Labor on October 17, 1768, the Southern Indian Department has a treaty with the Cherokee, and they're going to move the boundary line from the crest of the Appalachians. They're going to push it west. On the map here above me, I believe that is that's the red line. So they're going to push that line over to the Ohio River, meaning most of what is now West Virginia. This is going to now be opened up for settlement. Just a couple weeks later, you have the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in November 5th of 68. This is going to be the Northern Indian Department. Sir Johnson up there with the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations. They're going to push their boundary line out also to the Ohio River. But they go a little bit further than the Treaty of Hard Labor did. Now, Parliament wants to make this even. They want to make it simple. So they direct the South to have another treaty with the Cherokee, push the line a little bit further. So a couple years later, October 17th, 1770, the Treaty of Lochaber. This is going to be held at Deputy Superintendent Alexander Cameron's home, the Lochaber Plantation in what's now South Carolina. This is going to be the yellow line. They're going to push what had been the red boundary line. They're going to push it out to the yellow now, running all the way out to the Long Island of the Holston River in what is now Kingsport, Tennessee, and then running up to the Ohio River, where it's going to join up with that Treaty of Fort Stanwix line. So huge pushes west. And squatters have already headed deep into illegal territory, expecting there to be more treaties, expecting that eventually they're going to have their legal right to this territory. By the time of the American Revolution, 1775, you were looking at just 12 years after Parliament says no one crosses this line. There are over 2,000 white squatters just in Cherokee territory. 300 plus are up in Shawnee territory, what is now kind of Kentucky, a little more isolated up there. But in 1771, you've had all these treaties pushing the line west. They want to know where has the line ended up. The Donaldson Survey in 1771 is going to find out that one of the most populous, one of the biggest illegal settlements on the Watauga River in northeast Tennessee, it's actually too far south to be included in the Treaty of Lochaber. So they are still illegal settlements. So what are they going to do? They can't get anyone to claim jurisdiction over them. No one is going to support them, not Virginia, not North Carolina, because they are outside that Donaldson Survey. So they're going to make their own government. In 1772, they formed the Watauga Association, named after the river that they're living on. They're going to form up to govern themselves. Now, some people claim that this is the first democratic government west of the Appalachians. However, others say this is just glorified squatters' rights. So it's really interesting back and forth there, however you want to look at it. but they entered into kind of like a lease agreement with some Cherokee leaders, trying to find a way to explain, to justify their presence there outside of the agreed on boundary line. Now in 1773 and 74, you're going to see these competing land companies, not just individual speculators, but they're going to team up. They're going to pool their resources and start racing each other to see who can get the most land claimed prior to it being legal. So you're going to see companies like the Vandalia Company, the Louisa Company, the Transylvania Company eventually, also the Mississippi Land Company. These are going to be some of the different groups. In the spring of 1774, one of the Mississippi Land Company leaders, William Preston, he's going to send a survey crew out into Kentucky. One of his his partners, George Washington, is going to lay claim to 19,990 acres on the Kanawha River. And he's going to advertise, even though it's not legal to be there yet, he's going to advertise in newspapers back in the East, even in Europe, that he will pay passage and no rent for several years, religious freedom to any English, Irish, Scot, or German who would come and settle on his land. Again, trying to flip it and try to make a profit. Now in August of 1774, Richard Henderson of North Carolina, he's got his Louisa Company, mostly with North Carolinians. Names like John Williams, Thomas Hart, Nathaniel Hart, David Hart, John Luttrell, Leonard Bullock, James Hogg, and William Johnson. Some big names in North Carolina colonial history. They're going to be competing with the Virginians who are in the Mississippi Land Company, who had been started back in 1763. And here's some more recognizable names: William Fitzhugh, Arthur Lee, Richard Henry Lee, John Augustine Washington, and George Washington. They're going to start competing with each other over who can kind of get their surveyors out first. Now Henderson with the Transylvania Company is going to be so hopeful that a new treaty in 1775 is going to open up more land, that in December of 74, he's already advertising that it's open for settlement. He's putting it in newspapers. He's looking just a cheap down payment, 2 shillings per 100 acres is all of the rent you're going to have to pay. But that land sale doesn't happen. Parliament does not push the line further. In January 75, is when he's actually going to rename his company, officially make it the Transylvania Company, just meaning it's across the mountains. No vampires here. And in March of 75, Henderson is going to take matters into his own hands. He's going to call for a huge meeting with the Cherokee Nation at the Transylvania Purchase at Sycamore Shoals on the Watauga River. Over a couple days, he is going to meet with thousands of Cherokee leaders, and he is going to purchase. He says he purchased 27,000 square miles. That's roughly 20 million acres. This is the largest private real estate transaction in history. Now, there's going to be some opposition to this. The British Indian agents, they're saying this is not legal, do not agree to this. Later on, there's going to be some Cherokee leaders that say they misunderstood. They thought they were being compensated for the lease, compensated for all of the game that had been destroyed by the squatters. They didn't understand that it was a rights transaction. But this Transylvania Purchase is going to be huge. This is what makes the Watauga settlers believe that they are now tenants of the Transylvania Company. This is going to be a kind of a very resisted treaty. This is where you get this kind of a split happens within the Cherokee Nation leadership, and you get Siouxgunsany, Dragon Canoe, is going to stand against the treaty. He's not going to agree to this. He's going to say that the Cherokee leaders who did agree, it's only because they're old and they cannot hunt anymore, so they don't have a need for this land. But he says that a black cloud hung over the country. It was a bloody ground. It would be dark and difficult to settle it, is kind of the message he gives to Henderson and the other surveyors at the Transylvania Purchase. So that's going to be where we leave our people today. We've pushed south from Virginia. We've gotten into the Carolinas to Georgia. We've crossed over into across the Proclamation Line. What's going to happen next? When we rejoin this program, episode 3, we're going to talk about who are these people, what are they like, and what's their culture. So thank you for watching. Again, this is Ranger William with the Overmountain Victory National Historic Trail. Hope you enjoyed it.